the book came out of a dream. I was in Ephesus in Turkey back in the late 80s, I think it was, and I woke up in the morning in a pension having had this dream that I must go to the tomb of Rumi. No, of course I knew his work, but I wasn't aware that I was going to be writing about him. So I took the bus from Ephesus all the way to Konya, which was quite an extraordinary journey. As you can imagine, in Turkish buses mostly spend it on the wrong side of the road rather than the right side of the road. And I came to the tomb and was deeply impressed with the general atmosphere of this man. And I thought, well, look, you know, what can I do with him? I didn't know what to do with him. But in the end, I realized that nobody really explored his poetry and his relationship with Shams of Tabriz. That struck me as a very important story, not only in the life of Shams of Tabriz, but in the life generally of friendship as a construct, you know, because we never talk about friendship in its deeper and meaningful way. And Shams and Rumi and their life together seemed to me to evoke something that we were missing in the 20th century, at least when I was writing this book. And I decided that there were about 50 poems that were written exclusively about this relationship. He's written 26,000 couplets. He's a big writer, old Rumi, but there were only these very small group of poems that intimated the life and the love between these two great men. So I decided to translate them or transcribe them into modern poetry. Being a poet anyway, it was not something alien to me to take a poem and take an old text and render it into modern poetry. So that was the background to how I approached it. I took the concept that Ezra Pound, and people know Ezra Pound's work very well. He's a great American poet. He was a friend of T.S. Eliot. In fact, he actually corrected The Wasteland for T.S. Eliot. He always said that if you took an ancient poem, you could make it new again for a new generation. It didn't have to be an exact translation of the poem, because quite often in that process something's lost, you know. I mean, I think poets have a lot to contribute to the previous generation as poets. So in this sense, my work here is both Rumi and my reading of his text, and at the same time me as a poet imbuing the text for a modern British, you know, English-speaking audience, his words. So out of that, the book came. It's a strange and I think rather beautiful book, because it does go into the biography of the two men, but I've tried to sort of explore their relationship, the complexity of their relationship, the nature of spirituality in the context of the 13th century, because we're going back to a long time ago, 13th century. He was writing at the same time about 60 years before Dante. Dante was writing in the late 13th century and into the 14th. So they're very similar in their context where they come from as poets, Dante and Rumi. So I made it happen. It's been around for a long time. This is a new edition of the book, an extended edition, because recently I was in India and I came across the writings of Shams. Now, up to this point, we've never known that Shams wrote anything, but a text was found in Istanbul in the last 25 years of Shams's work. And Shams wrote poetry, wrote prose. He didn't write poetry. So I was able to, in the new edition, bring into context Shams's work as well. So you've got an extra sort of dimension to the life, and that wouldn't have happened 25 years ago when I wrote the book. I wouldn't have known about Shams as a writer. So all in all, it's been a very interesting experience. I've written, I don't know, more than 30 books, I think. I come from Australia, but I have lived much of my life over here in Europe and in North Africa. I've been deeply affected by traditional peoples, tribal peoples, Aborigines in particular. And so I've spent many years in the bush, living with Aborigines, talking to Aborigines, being on dreaming journeys with Aborigines, and also in the Torres Strait in Borneo, in Toraja, in Sulawesi. I've spent time living in longhouses and genuinely trying to bring to the fore, if you like, tribal thinking, traditional thinking, the way pre-literate people think, because their metaphysic, if you like, is as profound and in many ways more profound than ours because it's more ancient. So I've spent a lot of my years wandering through landscapes and places with tribal peoples, trying to bring to life their particular vision. And I was talking to a friend that I've only met today for the first time about the dreaming and how the dreaming has affected me as a person, and how the ancient tradition of Aborigines has given me an understanding of where spirituality comes from, how it emerges into the world. And of course with Native Americans and Australian Aborigines, you are dealing with people who understand their spirituality from the land, and the land is the thing that all of their text, if you like, is in landscape. And I was relating a story of an old man I knew called Mick Chagamara, and I'm a Chagamara too, because he made me his brother, so to speak. And when I was living up in the central desert of Australia, I used to go out into the bush out into the desert with him, and we would drive along in a four-wheel drive, and he would say, "Chagamara, stop here." I said, "Why? There's nothing out there." He said, "Yes, there is. There's a song out there." And he would stop the car. I would stop the car. He would get out. He would sit on the ground, and he would sing up the land. The song was in the land. And so I learned a great lesson as a writer, that landscape and earth actually contains language. That language emerges from the earth rather than from our cerebral consciousness. That language is deeply embedded in earth. And I think that that's the great lesson I have learned from tribal peoples, is that when you enter into the spirit of landscape and you sit by waterholes and you hear the stories of the great snake, it's not just, it is myth, but it's more than myth. It is the very structure of how we can and should think in relationship with the landscape. So I've learned a great deal from Aborigines. But my life as a writer has been largely determined by a deep sense that we had to find a new language to express the conflicted nature of our time in terms of spirituality. We have a bookshop here that's full of many fine books and great tradition of the spiritual life of the world. But in the 21st century, we've somehow lost our capacity to articulate it in a modern context in terms of our secularism, if you like, has denatured spirituality. And I felt conscious of, as a writer, of trying to make that possible again, that language, that the secret to an intimate spiritual life lay in language rather than just in the rituals and the gestures, the formalisms of language, of life, but that language itself has a deep context in terms of our spiritual life. And so that's, as a writer, that's been a very important thing to me, is to in a sense, much of my good ideas come from etymology. Seems strange, doesn't it? But etymology is a deep structure of the word, and where does the word come from? Sure, you go back into its Latin context or its Greek context, and slowly but surely new ideas emerge into your mind, and you can play with them. And so there have been novels. I think there's 5 or 6 novels out there. I've written books on St. Anthony of Egypt, who lived in a cave for 54 years. So I went to his cave, And it was a very interesting experience because in the process I met a man living in a cave nearby who became the character in Desert Father, which is not available. It was published in England under the title of Journey to the Inner Mountain, but it hasn't been in print for some time. But I met a man that was living in a cave who was living the life of St. Anthony. So you know you go to these strange places and you can meet these extraordinary human beings still struggling to find a meaningful spiritual life even in the desert of Egypt. A more recent book was a book I did called Fleeing Herod, in which I made a journey up the Nile River in the footsteps of the Holy Family. Now, very few people are aware that the Holy Family spent nearly 4 years in Egypt. We only know that they fled into Egypt, as far as the Gospels tell us, but the Coptic Church has a very strong tradition of the family in Egypt. So I followed the route that I found in the 5th century text all the way up the river to Al-Muharraq, which is not far from Luxor, where the family spent 6 months before they went back on the death of Herod. Herod, interestingly enough, died in 4 BC. Christ was born in 7 BC. And that sort of comes as a surprise to many people, because they think, oh, I thought he was born in 0, because that's where our calendar emerges. But actually he was born in 7 BC, which was the time of the census. If you remember, the family were moving towards, stopped in Bethlehem on the way home to Nazareth, because they had to be in the location where they could be part of the census. And so and we know that Herod died in 4 BC, so you can see that period between 7 BC and 4 BC is when the family spent their time in Egypt, approximately 4 years, 3.5 years. So I went up the river in the footsteps of the Holy Family. So they're the sort of journeys I've made in my career as a writer. I've stayed in many monasteries, Coptic monasteries in Egypt, which have been a profound experience because you're coming up against an ancient spirituality. And I met some very fine monks and nuns. I met some very fine nuns in the Delta. I remember I got quite sick in the Delta, and I ended up in a female monastery, and the nuns looked after me and gave me good food and got me back on my feet. And so I've had ups and downs on these trips. But that's part of being a writer and being in the desert and journeying along ancient myth lines. Now, I don't think I would have been able to do the book on Fleeing Herod if it wasn't for the fact that I understood Aboriginal life. They taught me how to go along a myth line. So when I went into Egypt, I was merely following an ancient myth line of, Christic thought, which was buried in the Coptic tradition. And I think the Aborigines taught me a lot. I did another book called Francis, A Saint's Way, in fact, where I wandered around Italy in the footsteps of Francis. I stayed in his caves and slept where he slept, and wrote a book about Francis. And I decided that he, in fact, was a white Aborigine. He was not, he'd lived this wandering life in Umbria and Toscana, and he went to Palestine at one time, and he went into Egypt as well. So the Aborigines had taught me how to go back into a European environment, excuse me, and find a way to re-express stories that are essentially European. So it's been a wonderful and enriching experience to have this double world of ancient Aboriginal and tribal life, and at the same time make that work in a context that reinvigorates the European tradition as well. So that's been a part of my experience, and I think it's been a rewarding one, and I've enjoyed the world that I've lived in as a writer. It is challenging, of course, because you lead a relatively lonely life. I mean, you spend most of your time in a room working or researching and turning up interesting information and then hoping that it'll make into a book. So I don't know, I think that's probably all I want to say. I think it'd be better to open up a general conversation if you wish to have it with me. and I'm happy to explore some ideas. I took a prose text in English, published in 1898.
Yes.
By a fellow,
By who?
I think it was Nicholson, very fine, what do you call it, Orientalist. He wrote a book, but he translated the text originally into a prose translation. Of course, as you know, translating poetry into prose is just about like chopping wood. Nothing comes out of it except split logs. So I then turned it back into poetry. And so I was using that. I didn't speak Persian and didn't make a pretense. In fact, I say in the book that this is a rendition of his work rather than an exact translation, because there are many translations out there, as you know, of Rumi's work. But in this case, you'll find a book that actually renders the spirit of poetry back into it. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that you, the reader, felt the extraordinary nature of this man through English language rather than through Persian. Well, that's a very good question. I think that poetry is the only deep language that we have. Prose is interesting, and I write a lot of prose, but essentially poetry is the only language. It's the only language that crosses the boundary from our conscious life into the other life.
And does that relate to the Aboriginal?
That's right,
yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
So when you engage with an Aborigine and he talks about the dreaming, he's talking about poetry. He's talking about the dance. He's talking about the ritual. And they are conscious of the value of the word. If you go to a ceremony, there's always a master of ceremonies in Aboriginal dancing, and they will say, you must say it exactly as it is. Don't actually make a mistake, otherwise the whole of the ceremony is ruined. So language is so important. That's where poetry, it seems to me, is as important as it should be today, but it's because of the way we live that we've lost that contact with poetry. But I love it. Yes, sir.
So you've been on this sort of literary journey. What was the drive for all this?
What's the drive for it?
And have you realised what you wanted to realise?
I have now. It's taken over 50 years to reach it. It is. I started, as I said, young writer living in London in 1965-6. I would never have imagined that I would have written the books I have. I think that there is a point reached where you know that you've got a work in you that you have to write that's going to be the most important work of your life. And it comes late in life. It doesn't necessarily come at the early stages. So in that sense, it has been a big journey. But I finally think I've cracked the nut, and I've written a trilogy of books which is unpublished at this stage, but it's ready to be published. Anybody have heard my other book? What is it called? A Mapmaker's Dream. It came out in England back in the 90s. It was quite an important book here. It's a book about a monk living in a monastery on an island off the coast, off Venice, who draws the most perfect map of the world, who is trying to draw the most perfect map of the world. And it was a very significant book of its time, and that led me to realize that I was dealing with texts that were ancient, but actually I was creating the ancient text. And it's quite an interesting relationship that a writer can have with the past. Quite often people would say to me, you don't speak Italian that well, how could you translate that text? I said, I didn't, I wrote it. And they said, but it's not real. I said, it is, I wrote it. So there's this irony of people would like to have text that's written in the 15th century, but when somebody in the 20th century writes the same text, they think, oh, there's something wrong here. And so that's the kind of friction or frisson that I live in as a writer, that I'm dealing with ancient realities as well as intensely modern ones. Yes, madam? Romantic love, in that sense. It's between two men, firstly. Our immediate psychological interpretation that they must have been gay, right? I don't hold to that sort of thinking. It seems to me rather superficial in 20th century or 21st century. I think that there people who live on the edge often engage in an experience in life that's so intense that it becomes transformative. And the relationship between Shams and Rumi was that. Rumi was a young scholar. He came from Balkh. His father was a scholar. In other words, he was destined to have a regular life in the Persian Arabic context. He would have spoken Arabic too, because he lived in Damascus for a long time. But Shams was a wild man. He was a wild creature. He was the Zorba. I talk about Zorba and the relationship between Zorba and the professor in the book, if you've ever read Zorba the Greek. I see that as a very interesting parallel. And there are great parallels. There's parallels between Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud, two great French poets who had a very tempestuous relationship, not as productive in terms of its relationship as this one. But there is occasions when two men or two women find that they can encounter themselves through the other more intensely than in a normal, passionate environment. And so Shams clearly saw in Rumi somebody who needed to be fired up, given a spine, made into the man that he became, rather than the scholar, the neat, expositor of doctrine in the Islamic sense. So from that point of view, I think they transform one another into out of that they formed a dance, the Sema, you've heard the Sema and the Sobek. That dance of the whirling dervishes is in fact created by Shams and Rumi. Ah, yes. And they used to spend 3 or 4 months together in the one room. They never left a room. They were fed through the doorway, Of course, it caused a lot of tensions with the disciples of Rumi, because Rumi himself had a whole range of people, including his family, living around him in Konya. And they became quite jealous of Shams. And in fact, it's likely that they killed Shams. We can't be sure. There is a suggestion that they did kill him. There is another suggestion that Shams just disappeared. He was angelic in that sense. He knew his time was up, so he moved on. So from that point of view, I think the relationship between two people of the same gender is deeply enriching, and I think that's what this book perfectly reflects.
What did Shams' writings show?
His writings are very, very unusual. They're much more robust, much more aggressive, like him. He was a tough cookie. He was a wanderer. He wandered around the Middle East, playing chess here and playing chess there, and getting into arguments with people. He was a wild man. He was what we would today call an eccentric, but in those days he was a spiritual wild fellow. His writing it's not poetic, but it's filled with kind of a push attitude towards things. Don't take things as they are, but push beyond it. So he's always aggressively trying to make a point through breaking the boundaries, if that makes sense. You'd have to read his work. It's not easy to find, of course. I only found it in India, so it hasn't been published here. But nevertheless, he was an interesting thinker. But he needed somebody like Rumi to put his thought into poetry. So that's why the relationship was so important, that one was enable the other one to become the great poet that he became. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What did Rumi say about the sin?
Being Islamic rather than Persian, you've got to remember he was Islamic. He was the other way. He was always espousing unity. Right? That was the whole great theme of his vision of life, was a life of union. And so his relationship with Shams was one of union and of unity rather than of dichotomy. So he wasn't, in that sense, he wasn't Persian. Shams is more Persian in many ways. Shams came from the assassin tribe, You know, you've heard of the assassins, and they were a group of people from northern, what we call Persia, northern Iran today. So he was a man that was imbued with that old idea, because assassins took marijuana, you know. That's why they became assassins. They got drugged up and went out and killed people. Shams was not that type of man, of course he wasn't. He was not that, but he came from that tribe. So you can imagine he comes from a group of people who quite happily take hashish and then move into a murderous situation. But unity was the theme, is the theme of Rumi's work. I mean, and also the theme is that everything transcends religions as we know them. He admired Christianity as much as he did Islam. He acknowledged Jesus Christ as important to him as Muhammad. There was this kind of sense of transcendence away from the old ideology of separation, which we're now living through. I mean, this is the irony of we're deeply imbued in a situation today where all of our social constructs, political, social, international politics, geopolitics, is deeply divided. It's the reverse of unity. And it's come to a great shock to us all, I'm sure, that we've, particularly older people like myself who've come out of the 60s, where we thought all of this was in the past, but now we're back in this deeply divisive world, left and right, politics of it. So the people like Shams and Rumi were also breaking down those barriers, and that's why there was a lot of tension in the environment of Rumi, that they wanted him out, get rid of this divisive character called Shams, because he's pushing Rumi into a state that we don't want him. He's outside the doctrine, right? Being outside the doctrine is a risky business, as we know. And I think that's the great story that he was talking about, unity, and that we're all one, and we're all engaged in the great tradition of discovery of the spiritual life. That to me is the biggest challenge we all confront right now.
At that time?
Yes, there was, but he's the founding of the Mevlana, his Sufi order is a founding order of Sufis, right? But it was, at that stage it was, let me say, primitive in its construct, but Sufis did exist, yes. The Sufis are the underside of Islam, there's no doubt about it. They're the ones that actually keep Islam slightly balanced, I think, because they don't promulgate the extremities that we're confronted with. Islam is not by nature extreme religion. Let's be face it, it's not an extreme religion. It's deeply imbued with the same values and constructs that we acknowledge as being European. But of course it can be distorted like anything else. I mean, Christianity's had embraced the same kind of internecine wars over the last 2,000 years. We know it's just as bad. It was happening in Ireland up until, 50 years ago. So it's not a particularly Islamic thing to be extreme. But I think that their relationship with unity transcended things and allowed them to bring to fore one of the greatest poets of any language. I mean, Rumi and Dante I put in the same category as poets, you know, and the Bhagavad Gita. They're all in that great tradition of spiritual poetry. I think it has. I think that the Americans, there's a lot of books on Rumi in America, as you know. They're not great translations. They seem to me to have been done for the sake of writing another book on Rumi. But yes, there has been, and you can hear them you get them on CDs and things like that, usually to the music of ney, you know, that beautiful flute. Yeah, it's a lovely instrument, and you do get it. Yeah. The title to Watkins. They said, you can't do that. Why not? They said, well, you just have to have a Rumi. I said, no, forget that. These two men were fighting for love, and that's why it's the title's Warriors of Love.
What was that? Fighting for love?
Fighting for love. Yeah, love was their great tradition, and they felt it. And I think in the first poem, it sort of captured that spirit. If you're love's lover and seek love, cut modesty's throat with a knife. Know that renown hinders insight, and thinking clearly understand. Did the madman reveal his madness? Did he, the wild one, display his guile? He tore his clothes, climbed mountains, drank poison, and chose death. Like a spider seizing its victim, the Lord is capable of seizing us in its web. Only Layla's face embodies such love, so why did the wild one leave us? The wild one, of course, is Shams. He'd left at this stage. He'd left and gone, disappeared. This is the first time he left. He came back, but he left in the first occasion. And of course, Rumi wrote a lot of this poetry in the absence of his friend who'd disappeared into Damascus. Have you read the divans of Waisa and Rahman, the stories of Wamik and Adra? You raise your clothes for fear of wetting them, knowing that into the sea you must plunge. Depravity and drunkenness are love's way as torrents descend rather than rise. It's a lovely idea, isn't it? The conflict between being depraved and drunk, but they're actually love's way. There's a lovely sort of way he turns on a thing. You will be a rock in a ring of lovers, the stone's slave as we are yours. Even as the sky enslaves the earth, even as the spirit enslaves the body, what does the earth lose by being bound as limbs are by the sweetness of reason? Don't beat a drum under your blanket. Brave man, plant your banner in the desert. Soul, listen to all the innumerable sounds echoing like a lover's lament in a green dome. When the buttons on your shirt burst open, know that it's caused by the drunkenness of love. Behold, heaven's triumph and Orion's surprise. How the world over is troubled by love, yet purified throughout. Just as the sun slays night and affliction trails after joy. I am silent. Speak, wild one, whose face every atom in the universe adores. Beautiful, isn't it? Very powerful. And so that's the kind of world. I also took them back to the couplet. Most of the translations are all just endless translation, but I went back to the original couplets of his, so they're in that lovely sense of the pithiness of a few words placed on paper, which is very much what he's like. So I hope that's given you some insight into a writer who loved this guy as much as anybody else, I suppose, and felt the need to give him re-expression and to bring to life a man like Shams, whom I think is one of the great, obviously one of the great inspirers of his time and of all time. So that's the world that I bring to you in this book and offer to you as a gift. Thank you.